All right. Shall we get started then? Good evening, everyone. How are we all doing today? All right. Sunny day at the very least, if slightly cooler. Humid though. All right. No one cares about the weather. Okay, so a couple of things. I've had more questions about the essay that. Again, I'll feel free to share with the rest of the class, just in case it is of interest for some people who may not want to ask questions or have not thought of asking questions. So two things. One, I've had a few people come to me and say, I'm not sure what to actually do, like what it entails to write a literary essay, right, so to speak, and how to actually approach it. Right? Part of the reason I didn't mention anything is because, as I talked about in first class, and as you probably saw from the shock on my face, I wasn't expecting to have to talk about this because, in my mind, I was not going to teach to people who are not in the English department, basically, which is my own fault. But my general indications would be: one, you can't go wrong necessarily with the basic essay format that most of you would have learned in high school, right? You can start with that understanding, and you'll probably do fine structure-wise. Okay? The basic idea of the essay that you would have learned still applies to the English department insofar as you are making an argument. It's just that the argument that you're making is about a text, right, rather than a concept or a pedagogical practice, whatever it may be, okay? A historical moment, so on and so forth. For the people who came to me specifically about ideas, right, what we talked about, my go-to place for any literary essay, right, whether it's for a class that I've taken before or for an article that I'm writing, whatever it may be, is to simply ask questions about the text. This was easier with the poems that we've been reading, right? It may not be as easy with the play, just because it's a little bit longer, so you'd have to reread it in order to get some of these questions out. But you can still ask questions about specific scenes, for example, of the play, or even the character list, as we will talk about today. That begs a lot of questions in and of itself. Okay. So you all had questions over the last few classes about the text. Sometimes you asked me, sometimes I asked you, and it generated further discussion. There's a reason why I ask those questions and why I encourage those questions, is because it leads us to expand our horizons about what these pieces of literature mean. Okay. The easiest example that I can give, I no longer have it on my USB key, but I can just use a different example if you really want to. But the easiest question that you could probably ask and actually get something relatively productive out of it is why, right? Why was a certain word chosen? Why was a certain theme chosen? Why did Jeanette Armstrong choose to write in the way that she did, right? Just to take a really easy example, okay? And then you go through the poem or you go through the piece and find proof that backs up your idea about why X, Y, or Z happened. Okay? Why does Jeanette Armstrong start by using a long line and then get smaller and smaller lines as you go along? There's plenty of reasons that you could probably think of, right? Some of them we've talked about in class, others you might come up with on your own. Okay? Your job as literary essayists for the next 3 weeks is to actually look through the literary archive that we're going to go through and find proof for your ideas. Okay? I will accept a lot of things as long as you can justify it in the actual literature. And that's part of the beauty of literature, is that it is highly interpretable. That doesn't mean that you can invent everything. It just means that you have a lot of leeway. Does that clarify certain things? I did have some people come to me and ask if I can give indications of as far as their writing was concerned, right? The actual physical writing and the structure of their arguments. Yes, I mentioned that briefly yesterday, but I'm happy to do that as well. I also recommend, if you want to do this beyond the class, right? If you think you're going to be writing essays outside of class, and you won't necessarily have access to me or any other teacher, I cannot recommend highly enough. You can actually get yourself plenty of great style books. Right? There's a reason why these books exist. I keep mentioning the library because I see it from the window here, so I keep thinking of it, but they have a million of them, I'm sure. Right? There's at least 5 or 6 style guides published every year. Okay, so there's a mountain of them. They're all pretty similar. The major difference is that the more modern ones will be more adapted to contemporary sensibilities. Right? But they are generally quite good and have been good for the last 40 years. Right? So generally, I do recommend that. And there's actually some in my office that you can feel free to borrow. I'm sure they haven't been touched in 30 years by the amount of dust that's on them. Okay? So feel free to actually drop by just to take one if you want to quickly reference some. Okay? All right, genuinely, are there any questions about that? Or good, cool. I'm also surprised by how many people want to talk about Isabella. I've had a few people who wanted to do that, so maybe I'll know for the future, I guess. All right, so if no one has any questions, there is one other thing I wanted to mention. Not essay related, but I guess technicality related. So how are we doing for the readings? How easy was it to finish Angélique for today? Show of hands, how many of you finished it? Okay, so half of you, a little bit over half of you. For those of you who didn't finish it, did you finish most of it? Half of it? Okay, good enough. The reason why I'm asking is because, as you may have seen, or may be aware, I assigned the novels on the Mondays. And the logic for that when I first did this was that, you would have the weekend, right, to kind of catch up. And it would basically be almost a full week between when we read Angélique, the first major work we're reading, and Finley's The Wars, right? It would give you a solid time to read it. Okay. Are we still okay with it being on Monday?
Does that mean that we'll talk about it Monday?
We'll talk about it Monday. And I must mention, I'm flexible about the other things. Insofar as if we don't finish talking about it on Monday, or if you're not finished reading the novel, no worries. We'll just continue talking about it on Tuesday, right? We'll extend the discussion. Okay? Does that make sense? Yeah. Are we still okay with having it on Monday? Yeah? All right. Try to aim for at least reading half of it, right? Just so it makes clear sense, one half on one day and one half on the other. If the majority of people tell me on Monday that they've managed to finish The Wars, fantastic. We'll do as much of it as we can on Monday. Okay. If not, so be it. Okay. I'm nothing if not somewhat flexible. Okay. Don't ask me to touch my toes, but I can adapt a syllabus, no problem. And like I mentioned, Finley is not is very short as a text. It's I would say it's maybe 1.5. 2.5 Angéliques, right? So if you have a physical copy, great. It's a nice break, and it reads pretty well. It's not a hot take to say that he's a really good writer. So there's a flow to the sentences that makes it easy to read. All right. So part of what I wanted to do for today is start off with yesterday's class, as one does. There's a reason for that. One of the things that I briefly talked about was how the Tisch not briefly, I talked about it extensively. The Tisch poetry group got its inspiration from an American group of poets, right, and literary thinkers. For us today, that doesn't seem like a particularly novel or even problematic idea. Okay? And I forgot, honestly, to come back around to it. But that is something that, at the time, critics, seeing what was coming out of that British Columbian student group, were very concerned about, right? Because that was something that was relatively new as far as Canadian literary history was concerned. For the longest time, and some of you may know this if you've taken a Canadian history class, right? The cultural kind of granddaddy for a lot of Anglo and even Franco-Canadian, cultural products, right, or cultural producers was Britain, right, not the United States. Okay? Even though the United States had been producing culture for a long, long time, right, there was still this kind of colonial hang-up for centuries that Great Britain was the arbiter of good taste where culture was concerned. Okay? And so to suddenly find inspiration down south, right, from a bunch of hippies, no less, was culturally mind-boggling for a lot of cultural critics here in Canada, right? And part of the reviews of the early Tisch poetry movement was stuff that was extremely negative and basically sounding the death toll of Canadian culture as a result of it. Right? Now we know now that that was rather apocalyptic of these critics, and not justified, because Canadian writers have continued to produce great stuff since then, right? Although you can argue left, right, and center that we have become a thoroughly Americanized culture, right? There's still something distinctive about Canadian literature, I think. And part of the reason also why a lot of people were critical, pop quiz time, I guess, what was happening around the time, historically, when Tisch was first starting to publish? Like 1960, mid-1960s. Why was that a historically important moment for Canadians? That they would react so viciously against quote-unquote Americanization?
Is it the centennial?
Yeah, exactly. The centennial year. Okay? Not really something we celebrate as much anymore, but in the 1960s, right? It's kind of hard to underestimate just to what extent people were living that high, right? Obviously, I wasn't around then, but I know from studying history and cultural history that that was a thing, right? There were events going everywhere. From my town, right, we had Expo 67 that year, which was considered by some to be the high watermark of Montreal at the time, right, in Montreal's history. There were all kinds of anthologies being produced that were trying to identify what Canadian culture and history was for the new century, right, which had already been like 60 years at this point, but whatever, right? What is the new Canadian culture? And I swear there's a point that'll transition us here. And so part of the reaction and backlash against Tisch being so Americanized is because of that very fact of inspiration in America rather than any kind of quote-unquote homegrown inspiration. And what you notice, however, in a lot of that supposedly homegrown inspiration and a lot of the rhetoric that was surrounding the centennial year and the ideas that people had about Canadian culture was that it tended to favor a very specific view of history. Despite the civil rights movements that we mentioned, right, in passing and explicitly throughout that class yesterday, a lot of the way that people talked about Canadian culture was still extremely normative. Right? I mean normative in the sense of favoring some kind of British ideal of what, I should say, white British ideal of Canadianness. Right? One that pretended that we were better than the United States because we didn't have slavery for so long. Are you starting to see where I'm going with this? It's not too subtle, right? But it was a genuine rhetoric, right? And you still sometimes hear that. I remember having this conversation with my parents, right? Who, for all intents and purposes, are well-meaning people, right? I wouldn't call my parents racists. And I remember having this conversation and saying, well, no, we did have slavery, right? We weren't better necessarily. Sure, we abolished it earlier, but we still did it, right? And a big part of why we don't think we had it is because of exactly the type of rhetoric that was developing around moments like the centennial year, where we chose to frame our history in a very specific manner. Our cultural history, our political history, name it kind of history. Now, that's not to say that the events that are framed in these centennial moments are wrong. Those moments did happen, right? But it again comes down to the fact of what we choose to focus on, what we choose to highlight or not as a society. Okay? I'll just keep using this example from Montreal because it's a Montreal-based play, so might as well, right? But you saw this all across North America, all across the world. It's the same idea of that debate that was had for a hot second about whether or not certain statues should be erected, right, or maintained, for example. I'm using the Montreal example because we have, or had, a statue of Sir John A. Macdonald, for example, in downtown Montreal. And during a protest that was actually unrelated to that statue, the protesters walked by and tore down that statue. Right? In part because of the racist policies that have been rightfully associated to that government. Right? And of course, that was part of like this whole thing of like, well, no, you're destroying history and so on and so forth. And it just goes to show just how much this willingness to frame certain types of histories is still with us today. This is not just a 1960s thing, this is a 21st century thing. And it will probably be a 24th century thing. Okay? As long as there are humans thinking about history, probably there will be someone making this argument in some way, shape, or form. And it's within that context that I think we can talk about Lorena Gale's Angélique. I wouldn't exactly call this a historical text, right? She plays fast and loose with the historical fact, if you want to call it that, like the capital H, capital F, historic fact. To good effect, by the way, it's a creative piece. I think she does a good job. I really like this play. But it's still truth, in a sense. And that distinction or that contemplation of the difference between truth and history is maybe a really good one to think about. It's not one that I'm going to necessarily explicitly talk about in great detail, but that I think you should keep in the back of your mind as we go through the class, because I think it's a good thought exercise at the very least, right? Even if it comes down to semantics. A really good example of this, because we might as well mention him at least once in our class, is Shakespeare, right? His historic plays are not at all historical, but they get at the sense of history, right, that he was thinking about, right? If you think of Julius Caesar, for example, right? Most of what we know or think we know about that moment when Julius Caesar was assassinated comes from that play. Was it historically accurate? No, but it has passed down as truth. Right? Brutus never said Julius Caesar never said "Et tu, Brutus" as he was dying, but it's become truth in our minds because because Shakespeare wrote it that way, and it's a banger line, right? That punctuates that play in a really interesting way. So that's what I'm thinking of when I'm saying truth and history are sometimes two different things. I actually can't believe I pulled that off between the Tish and Angélique as a movement. So part of the reason, I don't know if we'll talk about it just because we talked a lot about poetry in the past few days. I gave you the Afro Cooper text, the Afro Cooper poem, mostly as background. It's like a condensed version, basically, of the play. If you do want to talk about it in your essay, that could be a good point of comparison. If you want, that could be something that you can analyze. But for today, I think we'll leave it to the side for now, just to get to the meat of the play. Okay? But if you want to talk about it to me or in your essays, go for it. It's still a great poem. And Afro Cooper also wrote a formal history text about this moment. Right? So if you are interested in knowing more or learning more, she did write a piece of nonfiction on it. But for now, I want us to just take a second to contemplate this quote, which is not from the play. Immediate A+ if anyone can tell me where this quote is from. It's from a very famous novel, but it has nothing to do with Angélique. I'm sorry? No, oh no, I wish it was from Pride and Prejudice, but no. It's from a much darker and depressing novel. It's unfortunately been associated with Brolit now, even though the author would probably kill all those people. This is from Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. Right. Yeah, okay, you did you really? No. You could have. It's a very famous novel. It's a very good novel, right? Very dark novel. That does a similar thing to what Angélique is doing in that it recasts the Far West, right? The Wild West that we know and love, right? The cowboys going out into the whatever, right? The prairies, going out into the deserts of Nevada to find adventure. Right? And he recasts it as basically a horror show. And there's this line at the end where he says, men's memories are uncertain and the past that differs little. And the past that was, sorry, there's a word missing. That's my fault. The past that was differs little from the past that was not.
That's why I didn't get it.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. The past that was differs little from the past that was not. So what he's saying in this quote is very interesting. On the one hand, it gets out of what I was talking about earlier about truth and history often going into separate directions. And on the other, he's also talking about historical determinism. Right? There are forces, right? I guess you can call that force capital H history, to come back to that idea, that have a lot of sway over individuals' lives, right? Kind of gets at that other famous quote that, men make their own history, but they do not make it alone. And so it becomes rather interesting to think of this quote, especially in light of, some of the terms that are used in the play, right? When Angélique says things like, this time it will be different, near the beginning, right? Kind of setting out her manifesto for the play, right? Or her goals for the play, her desires for the play. but yet she's still part of the slave, narrative, so to speak. The moment of slavery continues after her, spoiler alert, death, right? So the past that was differs little from the past that was not. And I guess that's where the importance of what McCarthy here is calling memories, what we in this class would call literature, right? And what Lorena Gale, I guess, is calling theater, right? Is this imagining, right? What if, despite all the constraints of history, despite all the constraints of society, right, things will be a little bit different? And how? Right? Even if the events happen in the same way, we can talk about the historical reality of Angélique's existence, right? What little we know from the archive. I guess what becomes of that story, right, and how it impacts us today, even if the events didn't change, becomes somewhat important. Haven't lost anyone yet? Okay. I'll get off from my soapbox for a second and come back to a normal class. If you wanted to take another example aside from Cormac McCarthy, who's also a Black author, Toni Morrison does this a lot, right? Famously, her novel Beloved, right, is about the slave moment as well. But if you want, for me, you can't get better than The Bluest Eye, right, which talks about generations after slavery, right, who have to deal with this historical memory. Right? You're nodding. You've read
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Both of them. Yeah.
Great books.
Yep. Fantastic books. If we want to keep it within the Black Canadian context, I'm also thinking of George Eliot Clark, who some of you might have read as well. He's quite well known. He teaches at U of T now, and he wrote, mostly because he wanted to, because he's at that stage in his literary career where he could just write things for the hell of it, right? He basically rewrote The Merchant of Venice, right? And so it becomes this very interesting dialogue between a Black writer talking about another historically marginalized group, in this case, Jews, especially in The Merchant of Venice, which is all about that, right? And rewriting it in order to make it somewhat less racist. The racism is still there, but Shylock is a more sympathetic character, right? He literally just called it Merchant Retried, right? And so you do see this history in Canada and elsewhere of authors, Black, white, etc., inserting themselves into the historical moment through literature, right? Not to change history, but to reframe what it means to consider history. Right? So we're looking at one example, but you can find a million if you want. Right? There's actually a term for that. Timothy Finley, who we'll talk about next week, of course, is a master of it, or was a master of it. It's called historiographic metafiction, which is a fancy term for basically what I was just talking about, right? The reconsideration of history through fiction. Okay? We might come back to that term next week. We'll see.
Like James by Percival Everett.
I've never read that one, but I've heard of it.
It's very much a self-insert. I couldn't read it because it was too
right. It's
evil gazy.
Yeah.
Could this be similar to kind of like what's talked about a lot, like in movies and Hollywood stuff, that where it's kind of whitewashing in a sense? Is that kind of the same thing like in literary?
What do you mean by white? Like when you say
when you have stories that are known that they cast like a white person to play that could typically not be a white person,
Right. Okay. in a way, I think it's more insidious in the examples that you're giving, right? Because usually, at least the examples I'm referring to here, they don't mean to replace history, right? It's a genuinely active consideration of what these stories that are passed down from one generation to another have as an impact, right? What you're describing is like institutionalized racism, right? In a way, which I guess can be a form of rewriting, but I don't mean it necessarily in a negative sense here, right? But yeah, I guess that's a good example. Yeah. Again, I'll come back to the Clark example of the merchant retried, right? What he's not discounting that history or ignoring that Shylock is technically the villain, right, of Merchant of Venice. What he's doing is trying to make it so that the historical realities kind of shine through a little bit more in order to make the story at least more compelling to modern audiences who might read the original Shakespeare and be like, ugh, was he just a racist all along? No, I don't think so, but you get my drift. Yeah, did that answer your question?
I think so,
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. So one of the things that any kind of historical writing, and I guess we can use your example again of movies, of whitewashing movies. One of the things that any kind of historical narrative like Angélique or any of the other examples that I was talking about is that it inevitably relies on an audience expectation of history. If you're going to change something or reframe a historical moment, you kind of have to assume that the audience knows the historical moment that you're on board with, right? Or at least has some kind of background knowledge. Because otherwise the reframing just is not impactful. Right? So to use your example, Mark, of whitewashing and why sometimes it has a huge impact and other times it just is irrelevant, right? Is mostly in part because of how much people actually care about the historical moment, right? And to what extent people expect, to what extent people expect certain things from their historical fiction. Right? If they redid The Color Purple, right, as a movie, and they cast an all-white cast, right? Well, first of all, there would be riots in the street at that point if that happened. But that would fundamentally change what that story is about, right? It wouldn't work, right? Because if you did that, the themes, the ideas, the basic drive of the story would fall apart, right? And so you have a certain kind of expectation, right? But if one character, like say a secondary character whose race doesn't necessarily matter to the story, right, is changed from one, type of person to another, few people kind of bat their eyes, mostly because their expectation about the story is not, there, right, or is not fixed on that question of race. Is that a good thing? I don't know. I'm not the arbiter of that. At the end of the day, I'm happy to have that discussion, but I think that plays a huge part in how people react to these kinds of stories. So, expectations are significant. So whenever we look at a book like this, right, you can start by the cover. What do we expect if you see something like this? Or if you see a title like Angélique? Or even if you know that it's a slave narrative, technically speaking, what are your expectations? It's a bit hard to ask that question now that you have read the play. Right? But you can think of other slave narratives, right, that you would have read, Beloved, for example. What are your expectations of those stories? I'm genuinely asking the question here. Like, what would you think initially?
I might have thought that it was Creole at first because I would have assumed that there wasn't so much slavery in Canada because that's kind of the narrative that we're given.
Good.
Like my first instinct would be that it wasn't the thing that happened in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so not Canada, elsewhere. Okay, so you said Creole. That would almost make it. Ooh, that would make it really interesting, though, considering like Haiti's history of slave revolts, for example, right? So Creole or elsewhere, right? Not Canada. And even our like conventional quote unquote slave narratives, right? We often talk about American slave narratives, mostly because of the history of the Civil War and the enduring legacy of slavery. But here we had our own slave narratives around the same time as well, right? In the early 19th century. Right? So it's not like we don't have that literary history in the literal sense, right? But you're right, we don't have that expectation. If I said the name Marianne Shadd to the average person, probably wouldn't ring a bell to anyone. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, there you go. You might have, right, maybe a little bit few more people who recognize the name, at least. What other expectations might we have? Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Is it about you asking like when first on or
Well, I use the book as an example, but you can expand it out to slave narratives in general if you want. Yeah. Whichever direction you feel like taking the question. Yeah.
I feel like I didn't think it was as big as it actually was. Like
What do you mean as big?
like a video or like
Okay. Ooh, that's interesting. What do you mean not as big as a deal? What wasn't as big of a deal?
slavery, like what happened to them or like what they went through.
I'm paraphrasing here just for the sake of right, the space that I have on the board, right? Downplayed or underplayed. Good. And I think that's part of the difficulty of any kind of literary endeavor because you're necessarily limited by the space of a book. It's very hard to capture that scope.
Kind of what Ramon said about Creole and Rock Canada. The one part I remember was like it was kind of reversed in the sense like in most slavery stories, you're trying to escape the U.S. to Canada, for example. But in this one, they talk about going to New England instead. So it's like we're going from Canada to the U.S. to get freedom and run away. Or, I thought that was a little bit backwards.
Yeah. I wrote heaven again. It's not obviously we all know that Canada is not heaven, but in the sense of it subverts the literal movement that a lot of these narratives have, right? And this is like what we call narratology 101, story structure. Usually characters have a goal to go to, right? Take any story in popular fiction. I don't know why that's the first thing that popped in my mind. Harry Potter, right? He has a goal, for example. He has to defeat Wizard Hitler or whatever. Right?
He shall not be named.
Yeah, Voldemort. That's it. Sorry, I genuinely forgot his name. but right, so he has a specific goal, right? There's something to go towards. Sometimes it is just an abstract goal. Sometimes it's a physical going from one place to another, right? As in U.S. to Canada. Right? The Underground Railroad, for example, that great story. Which to some extent was true, right? After we abolished slavery here, some slaves from down south did come up to Canada. Usually that's where the story ends, right? Like they came to Canada and lived happily ever after. I would invite you to look into the history of Black communities in places like Nova Scotia, for example, right? There was literally a part of what's now Halifax called Africville, right, or Africaville, depending on who was writing about it, which was meant to be a safe haven for escaped slaves, right? But the history of institutionalized racism that community suffered kind of underplays just to what extent Canada actually was a safe haven of progressive politics. Was it better than slavery? Yes, right. I think a lot of people would say that. But it wasn't 100% happy-go-lucky either. Good. What about just our expectations on a story level, right? So, Mark, you kind of got at that with the going up to Canada part. But if someone pitches you a story about a slave, right, who at the beginning says this time is going to be different, where do you think that story is going to end? What are your initial expectations about the ending of that story? Is it a happy story at the end? Do we believe, Angélique? Like this time it'll be different?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good. I know I did, right? Before I knew anything about the actual history, I was like, oh, this is like, she's going to escape slavery, right? She's going to be freed by her master or whatever. She's going to escape and, liberalism prevails or whatever, right?
I don't think I had that vibe. I thought
Good.
she was delusional.
Okay, but that's a different expectation.
She was like, she just kept saying that over and over. Like
So,
almost trying to convince herself. But
Yeah, that would be my interpretation too. Like,
delusion.
like she
Good.
had tried to escape many times, and she was sure every time
Right.
escape different.
I'm talking like before actually starting like page 1, but yeah, that's good. Like the delusion part is actually also an expectation, right? At the end of the day, like that's what you think is going to happen. Right? In a way, it's kind of true, kind of not. We can get to the ending. Well, we will talk about the ending and how her story wraps up. But it's.
I guess if I went back
technically
before I read anything, I did think it would be a happy story.
Good. Okay. One would hope. I think we're kind of hardwired, not because there's only those types of stories, but I think we've just been so ingrained over the past, let's say, 150 years to be generous, 200 years maybe, of like popular fiction telling us that that's how stories end, is, with happiness. This comes back to the Victorian morality that I was talking about last time, right? Where we had an expectation that the evil person would get their comeuppance. Okay? And I think that's something that sticks around with us a lot. Right? Just look at the 1.5 million James Patterson novels that come out every single year, right? No shade to James Patterson, good on him for making like bank so quickly on those books, right? But a lot of them follow that trajectory still, right? Where the bad guy gets killed or goes to prison at the end. The Marvel movies are really popular, well, not as popular anymore, but they superhero movies are a dime a dozen, and they always end on that same trajectory as well. Right? It's part of our expectation. If it doesn't, we're like, oh my god. Right? That's literally with that other one, where Thanos won and he snapped his fingers or whatever. They all died. You're like, what's gonna happen? And then the next one, they all come back to life, right? Literally, we cannot not have a happy ending. Right? Batman has to beat up poor people. Superman has to save a dying planet, right? Spider-Man has to punch the Green Goblin, etc., etc. Right? Happy endings, they're everywhere. You're saying no. I agree. It's always
Iron
going.
Man died.
Yeah, but after like how many movies?
But still, that's not a happy ending then.
Yeah,
It's not a happy ending for him, but you feel it cathartic though.
What if Spider-Man, like the last one?
Oh yeah, he had to wipe everyone's memory.
Yeah.
Spoiler.
Yeah, spoiler, I guess. But there's a difference between, obviously there are exceptions to this, right? I'm not saying that there are no variations on any story ever, right? I'm demonstrating that it's a frequent enough occurrence that we have it as an expectation, right? Today on things that I wasn't expecting to talk about, Batman. Okay. So I think I want to start or get, because we kind of touched on these two tangentially. I think I want to kind of get to this third question. And that will transition me nicely, I think, into the play itself. When does the actual text of Angélique begin? Where does it begin? Might also be another question that we might ask.
What's the 1730s?
Okay, so you're taking that question at the literal, no, it's fine. No, that's a good answer, right? It takes place in 1730s. Yeah.
Oh, Montreal.
Mm-hmm. But then again, does it take place in the 1730s?
Yeah, because she switches between modern settings and historical settings.
There's an OJ reference.
There's an O.J. Simpson reference dating the book inevitably into its very specific moment in 1998, 2 years after the O.J. Simpson thing. 2 years? 3 years? Oh. We can talk about O.J. Simpson. Because that's a whole other narrative of racializing criminals that's very interesting for those of you who remember that moment. So yeah, if you look at the very first page, technically, of the play, right, the character list, time, the present, and 1730s. Then is now, now is then. Why do you think I have this quote? But then the place, Montreal 1700s. So there's almost a bit of a contradiction there. And also, why is 1700s in a place section? Right? As if time is a different, right? As if history is a different country altogether. So immediately we get doubts as to when the text begins, right? On a literal fundamental setting level, right? But then again, you get an indication of what the text is about even before that. Right? How many of you read the dedication? One person. Yeah, okay, Mark. If you want, by the way, to get A+ in your next English class, if ever you take an English class, you can always find all kinds of really interesting information before the actual text starts. Right? There's always a wealth of information there. Right? And this one's one of them. Sometimes it's more important than others. I dedicate this book to my mom, the late Lillian Madden, who slaved, interesting choice of words, all her life for minimum wage and still managed to house, feed, and clothe, and educate 5 children. And to my son, Clayton Cooper, may he never know the hardships previous generations have endured. Then is now. The book, right in the dedication, is telling you exactly what it's going to be about. Okay? Not just in its playing with history, right? I'm not only dedicating this to past generations, but future generations. It's talking about labor, right? The housing, feeding, and clothing, and educating. It's talking about motherhood, 5 children. It's talking about slavery, naturally, and what it means to use the term slavery. We can maybe talk about that in relation to Angélique's conversation, which I am obsessed with Manon, right? The indigenous servant. She insists on calling herself.
It's a girl.
Manon is a girl's name. Unless I'm mistaken. Right, yeah, Indian slave. So Manon is a French woman's name.
I don't speak French.
No, that's fair. There are some things in here that when I first decided to put it on my syllabus, I was like, how much will I have to explain to people who may or may not speak French? But I don't think there's much here, aside from names. No. Because any French words that do appear are usually translated right after. So, okay. Does the text even begin before that dedication? What were we just saying about expectations? May seem like a facile thing to say, but upon picking up this book, for those of you who have the physical copy, or even when you downloaded it on your e-reader, you would have formed your expectation of the story in your mind, right? The text took some kind of shape even before you read it. And I think she's very much playing with this, right? And constantly contradicting herself, going from past to present in 1998, of course, but not really that different now, and so on. I'm not going to play the entire thing. Like I said, couldn't find a video version of Angélique the play, but I found a different one-woman show that Lorena Gale did for an event. Like I said, I'm not going to play the whole thing because it's 35 minutes long, but I'll put it on Moodle if you want to watch it. Right? I feel free. But this is another show where what she's doing is very explicitly playing with tropes in this case. Okay, for this, it's the tropes of African American characters, right, or Black characters. I'll play it in 2 minutes. That's Lorena Gale, by the way. So I think you can start to see that this is a recurring theme in her work. Some of the stuff that she brings up in this is almost explicitly referenced or brought up again by other characters, right? The way that François speaks, right, and treats Angélique before his untimely demise makes you think of some of the expectations that he had about Africans, right? Sexual beings, right? Savages. You can argue that since Lorena Gale's time, it has gotten a little bit better in the literary landscape, right? There is an explosion of African American writers who have worked diligently to change these expectations. I'm thinking of people like Colson Whitehead, for example. But then again, not that different. I remember 2 years ago, I was in Senegal for a trip, and that year, or just the year before, a Senegalese person had won the Prix Goncourt, which, if you don't know, is a literary prize in France, right? Very, very well recognized and institutionally respected prize in French literature and Francophone literature. Right? And I remember talking to some of the people that I encountered, right, about their thoughts, because I was like, "Oh, don't you find it wonderful that one of your kinsmen, right, like a Senegalese person, won this great literary prize? Like, what do you think about it?" And overwhelmingly, a lot of them didn't like it, in part because they felt that that novel perpetrated a lot of the tropes that Lorena Gale is criticizing 30 years ago in this play. Okay? They felt that it was a misogynistic book, right? That it was demonstrating a vision of Senegalese people and West African people more broadly that was backwards. Now, this doesn't mean that like everyone shared this opinion, of course, but I think it's noteworthy that that rhetoric and that discourse is still happening 30 years on. Right? And that such a novel is the one that gets institutional recognition by such a prestigious prize as the Prix Goncourt.
I mean, it's France we're talking about.
Famously, France has an issue talking about its history of colonialism and racism. If you haven't been to France, it is a significant and noticeable problem. Britain as well has a bit of a hang-up on that one. Right? I wonder why. And on one hand, I don't sympathize. I understand that you don't want to or you don't know how to address something like this. It is a very difficult thing to do. But to not even try is, in my opinion, unforgivable in the 21st century. And it's something that I think you should keep in the back of your mind with tomorrow's literature. Because it's something that will concern Jordan Abel and Liz Howard a lot as writers. Right? Like, what do you do with that legacy? Lorena Gale is looking to the past and addressing that legacy. Jordan Abel and Liz Howard are looking to the right now very specifically, without explicitly referencing the past sometimes, but it's always there in the background.
This isn't the right topic, but like, do you think that, by comparison, Canada's doing a great job by trying to acknowledge the history?
Which one, sorry?
Basically colonialism in Canada. Like, do you think that Canada's doing an okay job trying to address it by comparison to, let's say, France or Great Britain?
I think we're doing better. I think there's still a lot of work to be done. Yeah. We're doing certainly better than we used to, I think.
And another thing, sorry, but is that North America that she's drawing there? Because I just can't see anything else. But it's like kind of like a crude version of North America.
I think it's a crude version of North America, yeah. I think it's supposed to be just this weird, like, Quebec, Newfoundland, all thought of here. And
Hudson Bay's kind of
yeah.
Just couldn't see it.
Yeah, I think I didn't finish the entire thing, but I'm pretty sure that's what she's going for, and the nice clean colonial lines of the states and provinces. Yeah. Which you can never unsee how straight they are. Right down to the individual farms. It's a question that has been haunting Canada for a long time, right? Are we a post-colonial nation? That's a loaded term, right? It's so loaded that a lot of writers and thinkers are no longer using it to define Canada because we haven't even gone through the decolonial phase yet, according to them, these thinkers. You can agree or disagree, like that's, again, up to you to back yourself up on that one, but it's worth adding on to what you were saying, I guess. Yeah. In 1999, there was a book of essays that was published by Wilfred U. Press. Shoot, who was the main editor of that one? Oh, I've met her in person, and I can't remember her name. But yeah, in 1999, there was already a book that came out that asked, "Is Canada post-colonial?" The year after this came out. I think that kind of answers the question in and of itself, doesn't it? Right? I think a lot of the writers in that book were also saying, like, no. But it was interesting that the question was floating around already at that time. I think to finish off, there are I have my issues with him as a prime minister, but I think the work that Justin Trudeau did on a political level demonstrates a willingness for people to move into a new direction, right? Having so many Indigenous people in his government and so on and so forth. Or the fact, like we were talking about after class or during the break, that in Manitoba you have an Indigenous prime minister is kind of really encouraging, right? But there's still work to be done. Okay. Tangents aside, not too much of a tangent. We'll be generous here. Let's get back to the play. So before taking a break, I want to finish up looking at the character list, and then after the break, we'll dive more deeply into the play. Does that work for everyone? Cool. So I'll launch the question to you. So we talked about time, place. Is there anything in particular that you noticed about the character list? There's some really interesting moments in it. And again, indication that you should always pay attention to every part of a text. What jumps out at us in the character list?
Well, for me, the first thing was how many lovers she had.
Uh-huh. So Claude, right? The Francheville's indentured servant, Angélique's lover. And then César, slave owned by Ignace Gamelin, lover to Angélique. Interesting choice of words there, considering how César and Angélique's relationship is framed and encouraged, right? We can get to that, but there may be a distinction here between someone's lover and lover to, right? That Lorena Gale is playing with. And again, it's one of those things that when you read it the first time, you don't necessarily understand the implications of. You read this and you're like, okay, it's just a different formulation, right? A bit of an odd formulation to say lover to Angélique, but I can understand technically what it means, right? And then you read the play and you think back to that and you're like, maybe it wasn't that anodyne of a choice, right? Considering one is consensual, one less than consensual, to put it lightly. Good. What else?
The ages kind of seemed odd. Early
Interesting.
30s, 40-ish.
Mhm.
And then Angélique was the only, her and François were the only specific. Oh, and
Yeah, Thérèse, yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. So the main characters get specific ages. The secondary characters seem to get broad ages, so to speak. Which I guess, what do you make of that?
I'm not totally sure.
Yeah. I'm not. Yeah, I don't know either. I guess you could maybe be generous and say that it's the kind of thing that they're more fleshed out characters. She has a more precise idea of what they are supposed to be and how they're supposed to act. So maybe in that sense, but
Yeah, she's more focused on
Yeah.
Angélique, I guess.
Yeah,
Do you think there's a reason why she does that?
that's what I'm saying. Like I think it's just a question of specificity for those main characters, but I don't know. Now that you mention it, Moon, I'm paying attention to it, but I have to admit it's not something that I thought about until this very moment. Right? Marie-Joseph Angélique, a slave in a Canadian history book.
She's been relegated to just some dusty old book on a shelf. Nobody knows about her.
Okay, good. So she's been relegated to the history bin, the dustbin of history, right? Also, how are people painted in history books usually? Have you ever read a history textbook? I don't blame you, they're boring and dry. Most of them. Some of them are really interesting. A lot of history textbooks focus more on events than people. And I can understand from a writing perspective why that happens, right? But it is also rather a clear indicator. I feel like I use that word a lot, indicative, but it demonstrates how individual agency throughout history has been kind of glossed over in the way that we talk about history. Right? And that's part of the reason why there was a big movement, especially from, say, the 70s and 80s onward in historical perspectives, to focus on what's called social history, quote unquote, right? Which tends to focus more on individuals' actions, right? Or communities, right? Rather than the events and sometimes the great men of history who, make those decisions, because obviously Winston Churchill is the greatest figure to ever exist in World War II history. And we should only focus books after books after books on him and Hitler and Stalin. There are so many books on those three guys. And nothing, or almost nothing, on the millions of people who actually were on the front lines. Right? So to say that she's in a history textbook, not only is Lorena Gale just saying like, haha, you're reading a book, right? But also pointing to how we actually do write history and think of history. She's not there today, but I forget what her name was, but the person who asked about the archive, like how do we know about all of these books, right? And have access to these books. The only reason we know about Angélique is because of the trial records. It's not like François, the historical person, wrote about this, right? We know because she was arrested and, again, spoilers for those of you who didn't finish it, hanged, right? And the courts of New France, which it was known as the time, wrote about it. Right? So the archive, the historical archive, is doing some work here, right? The written record, but it's not enough because it's only just a surface level of this slave did this according to X, Y, and Z witness. Did she really? And now it's up to Lorena Gale to fill in the gaps.
Can I point out something that I noticed
Please.
as well, just on a maybe smaller scale?
Yep.
Just her name in general, Marie-Joseph Angélique. Like, I feel like for a slave to have a name like that, like, I mean, oftentimes from what I've seen, it's like you have one name, and I feel like Marie-Joseph, that's a very Catholic name given to her. And I mean, like, I do know, again, like, there's other things that happen in the book where people name baby
Yeah.
for her, essentially. But like, I just felt that her name was interesting, and I wasn't sure if that was typical for like a slave to be given a name like that.
Does anyone have an answer to that? Okay.
Did they change your name?
Well, that's kind of what I thought as well. But like,
And
it's interesting to
yes,
think about.
so there. Again, I'm not. My knowledge of slavery's history overall is more limited than others who are specialized in this area. From what I understood, is that yes, usually slave owners would change names, or at the very least, not give a name, like a formally recognized Catholic, Christian, whatever name, right? This is not exclusive to North American slavery, by the way. The history of slavery writ large often requires is an awful term to use here, demands by its very quote unquote logic or assumptions, right, that the slave be dehumanized. And the changing or removing of those names, of their original names, is one way in which that happens, right? Which is why, again, coming back to the history of African American or just broadly Black authors, you see a lot of writers renaming themselves. The most famous example being Malcolm X, right? The X is not accidental. Has anyone seen the movie Malcolm X? No? Okay. Yeah, you have. Do you remember why it's X? No? First of all, watch the movie. It's incredible. It's a Spike Lee movie. One of the most shocking movies I've ever seen in my life.
I mean, I do know, like, in history for, like, slaves or even Indigenous people in Canada, they couldn't write, so they would just sign things for the next.
That's exactly why.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. You removed my name, so that will become my name is the X, right? It becomes a form of kind of appropriation or reappropriation, right? In the same way that, to use a different example, the word queer has kind of been reappropriated by the LGBTQ community, where it used to be a slur, right? You can't, like, the word can no longer hurt me if I use it on myself, for example. But yeah, and they bring this up explicitly, right? In scene 3, Act 1, scene 3, when Angélique says, Angélique, Marie-Joseph, and Thérèse answers, after my sister, Marie-Joseph de Coin.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So you're right, it is a Catholic name. In this case, Thérèse would come from France. Right? Thérèse and François would have come from France. A famously Catholic place. And also, she mentions it a little bit later, right? Baptized in Montreal, June 28, 1730. Again, for those of you who are less familiar with the whole process and meaning behind baptism, right? It is literally the rebirth, right? That's what symbolically it is supposed to be, right? That's why Jesus himself, according to the Bible, had himself baptized, right, by John, famously the Baptist, right? Because it was a kind of rebirth, right, symbolic. Here it's distorted. Right? The baptism is one of renaming, right, the slave to have the Catholic name, right, and to be, at least nominally, within the Catholic faith.
Do you think that they believed somehow that they were saving her soul by rebaptizing her? So they could just do whatever they want because her soul was saved?
You know, that's a really good reading. I can't say with any kind of certainty whether that's true or not. I'm sure on some level there's a belief in that. This could be almost an entire class on... When I say logic, by the way, I don't mean that it's a logical thing to say, but like the underlying assumptions, right, and motivators behind these types of things. So what would be really interesting to examine is, yeah, exactly that, the logic and the rhetoric behind that Christianizing mission.
There's a lot of discourse in Christianity of like, save their soul, nothing else really matters.
Yeah, and people would. This is not going to be a history of theology class, of course, but like people within the Christian faith have had schisms over that interpretation, right? Aside, let alone from its tying to colonialism. That's how we got the Protestant Reformation and so on and so forth. Was what exactly does it mean to save someone's soul? Is it an actual thing? Is hell real? Right? Are we actually dooming someone who is not baptized to a lifetime of misery, right, with demons and pitchforks? Right? There have been years-long debates about this. I'm sure on some level people did believe it, right? To what extent that justified the actual horror, I don't know if that's wishful thinking on the part of the people committing the atrocities, right? Or just a self-justification. I don't.
A lot of horrors have been justified.
And I don't know if there's a thing about this with Catholicism or whatever, but the repenting is a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if there's like a connection between repenting against somebody who is Catholic as well.
Mm-hmm.
That maybe would lessen something.
Yeah. The more we're talking about it, the more I'm thinking, that makes perfect sense in my mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
That this kind of discourse would exist, not that it was a thing. Right. The first thing that Europeans brought to America were priests, right? And the notion of savage heathens, right, that Lorena Gale brought up, is a discourse that you see from early colonialism onward, right? But even before that, in the Middle Ages, the way that people talked about heretics mirrors that in very interesting ways, which is why there are some historians and philosophers who say that the seeds for the kind of rhetoric that you would see during the colonial period did not even begin in the 15th century with Christopher Columbus going around the globe. It started centuries before. Right? Again, I'm not going to be the one who can say that with any kind of certainty because I'm not well versed enough in that history, but I know that that discussion happens. Right? I wasn't, again, you guys surprised me about where we go with these with these discussions. That's great. Was there anything else that we noticed? Well, yeah, we have time for one last thing. It's worth noting, I think, the terms that are used. Because again, like the dedication, it sets out a lot of the main themes and conversations that are going to be occurring in the rest of the play. Okay. So Marie-Joseph Angélique is referred to as a slave. François Poulain Francheville is referred to as a merchant, and owner first of the ironworks, and Angélique second. Right? And this question of ownership, of course, comes back. Right? What does it mean to own something? Is there a difference when we talk about owning an iron work or a person? We, as enlightened moderns, would say yes. François might say no.
It doesn't list him as owning Claude.
Mm-hmm. So Claude is referred to as an indentured servant. Technically, Claude is there of his own volition. Technically. But then again, that also comes up. What kind of difference is there between a slave and a person who's like, I don't have enough money, so I'm going to basically do whatever you tell me to do for X number of years, and there's nothing I can do about it because I'm paying off a debt with labor. So there's that class element that comes in. I forget if it's mentioned. Usually indentured servants were white, right? So there's that class element. You saw a lot of Irish people, for example, be indentured servants. We call Irish people white now. For a long time, they were not considered white in the popular discourse because they were considered less than, quote unquote. Right? So they were usually indentured servants. Again, Ignace, a merchant. Interestingly, Ignace is not mentioned as the owner of César, but César is mentioned as the slave of Ignace.
I noticed that for Therese too, like the wife of Francois. And she also, like, it doesn't say that she owns, but at the end of the book, she.
Yeah. She owns her. She owns her because her husband died, so she becomes de facto owner. And then that comes into a whole, like, really interesting discussion that is never played through that much, but the role of women, right, in history. We don't necessarily associate women with owning property in the 1700s, especially not in the very conservative New France, right? For those of you who don't know, usually the only people who had rights in societies like this were people who owned property, right? Men, women, whatever. Right? That's why slaves had no rights, because they were property. They did not own property.
Right? It wasn't just like Angélique was in question too. Mm-hmm. They were trying to force her to sell the ironworks.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Part of it is because, right, he says, you can't make those decisions. You don't know enough about the workings of the iron factory, the ironworks, to make these decisions. Ergo, you must sell and let the big boys do them. I point myself as if I'm a big. I have no idea how to run an iron mill. And yes, Manon. First of all, interesting use of Indian, and then slave. She herself later will come back to this, I imagine, does not refer to herself as a slave, right? And of course, the term Indian is itself a colonial term. Right? One that's slowly undergoing the similar trajectory as queer, where a lot of indigenous people will use that term in writings or in self-referential ways in order to bring back that term into their own world.
Like maybe it's a time that I live in, but I also, when I read that, I was like, are they East Indian or are they talking about?
Yeah.
You know, I didn't quite know at first.
Yeah.
So either could have been true, I suppose.
Yeah. I think the only reason I didn't make that connection was because of the time period in which it takes place. I don't know to what extent there were a lot of Southeast Indians in New France. There might have been, but I don't know.
Something I thought of too that was interesting was like the beginning. Francois is like talking, he's like doing his monologue about getting his epiphany to make his wife smile at her slave, right?
Yeah.
He meets a shady guy who has like slaves and brings out Angélique with her, but like Angélique seems to know French right off the bat, so I kind of was like, okay, I don't know like history super well enough for like French colonies in Africa. I don't know if she would have known French or not.
Well, Madeira is not French.
I'm sorry?
Madeira is not French, where she was born.
Oh, yeah, that's right. They did mention where she's from.
It's from Portugal. Yeah. So some slaves would have learned their master's language for the purposes of communication. But again, discursive language is very tricky. Right? That's why a lot of, just to use that simple example, American slave owners in the South didn't want their slaves to read, right? Because if they actually learned how to read and learned to read, for example, the Bible that usually slave owners were using to justify their existence through a very skewed vision of the Bible, I might add, right? Then you would have a revolt on your hands. Right? And so you need to, as a slave owner, right, there's that balancing act that needs to take place of I need to be able to communicate my orders, but they cannot be too smart or taught too much, because otherwise they'll know that I'm basically the worst person on the face of the planet.
Also,
Yeah.
a callback to that Philip poem when their native language or their mother tongue was taken away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Also, I don't think it's a skewed reading of the Bible. It justifies slavery pretty clearly in the Bible.
The ownership of people, yeah, like
But it's like a lot of things. Like if you take it within that very specific context, yes, but also you have other passages where the slaves explicitly free themselves.
Sure.
Right.
I mean,
Like,
the Bible's
you
just
can-
full of problematic stuff.
Exactly.
That's all I'm saying.
It's a series of stories that you can make mean a lot of different things. Right? It's vague enough that, or it's subject to interpretation enough, which is why it's a piece of literature, worthy of interpretation in its own right.
Well, this is exactly how they do
exactly.
sermons every Sunday. They pick a spot, they try to make it fit
Mhm.
a general narrative that they want to convey. That
Yeah. And sometimes it works, right? A good preacher will make that work in a really effective way, right? Sorry. But yeah, so you're right that there are passages in the Bible that do justify slavery, but the point is that if the slave then can read the Bible, they can subsequently find the passages that go against that as well, right? I'd forgotten this, but now that I'm looking to the passage that Mark, you mentioned, our daughter Marie-Angélique had been dead for 2 years, right? So Marie-Angélique then takes again the place of Marie-Angélique the slave becomes a stand-in for Marie-Angélique the daughter, right? Which is an awful thought to have, but it's effective as an image insofar as it sets up very clearly the patriarchal standards, right? On the most literal basic level of like François and Thérèse see themselves as parents too, right? Which justifies how they talk down to Marie-Angélique. And to come back to your point now of how a lot of figures in power use a similar type of paternalistic rhetoric to talk down to all kinds of people. In residential schools, that was a thing, right? The discourse of paternalism. But even in the way that people talk down to just any kind of other, right? It doesn't have to be a racial minority or a religious minority, right? It doesn't have to be. The way that, to take a modern example, right, very, very conservative people talk down to workers looking for better labor rights. You don't know what you're talking about. We know what's best for you. And that means cutting into your rights and your paycheck for the sake of, quote unquote, the economy that we know about, right? Less enlightened politicians. That kind of paternalism is everywhere, right? There you go. I can stand out for my political soapbox now. Hey, it only took an hour and a half and we got through 2 scenes, ladies and gentlemen. No, but I did want to spend a little bit of time on the, as you can see, on those first parts, because I think, and this is where I'll stop before giving you a break, this comes back to what I was saying earlier at the end, later at the end of yesterday's class, was that this is a very interesting piece of literature in the sense that, yes, it is written to be performed, right, as a theater play should, but it's doing something that very few play scripts actually do, which is be a piece of literature on its own. And that's kind of interesting. I don't quite know what to make of that yet. I'm developing an idea of it that maybe we can get to later. But you don't see that in very, very many plays. Right? I'll just use this as an example for comparison, but like if you read a Shakespeare play, you kind of do miss half of it because when he wrote it, he was assuming that no one would read it. Right? So some of the physical jokes are missing. because they would have just been performed on the stage, and he didn't feel the need to write it down. The fights are missing, so from one line to another, a character will die, and it's just assumed that there would be a 5 to 10 minute fight between the lines. Right? That would be entertaining, presumably, but we don't get that as readers. We have to piece it together. Like, oh, suddenly Mercutio's dead. Well, crap. Okay. And so this is a very interesting material in that sense. So that's why I wanted to spend so much time on what it's actually doing as a framing, as a piece of theater framing. All right. Take a few minutes of break, and yeah, when we come back, we'll get a little bit deeper into the play itself.
Oh, for sure.
Oh, thank you.
There it is. So as you can tell, that's fine. As you can tell from our extensive conversation on 2.5 pages, that we can kind of go into any direction with this. So I'm gonna, as you know, go like full spoilers on this. I don't really mind doing that. Can it really be a spoiler for like a 500-year-old narrative at this point? I don't think so. So I forget what your name is with the iced coffee. Annalie. I was going to say Lee, but Lee's the one who's sitting next to you. Yeah, okay. Annalie, what's something that struck you about the text that could give us something to talk about for?
Like, of the entire play?
Yeah.
I didn't really like the ending. Like how he just ran away.
Might as well start with the end. Yeah, we can work our way back. I guess that's kind of the point, is that...
I didn't like that. He ran away and then...
Wait, when you say he? Oh, yeah, Shuklov. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So...
I was so excited. Like, they're going to get their happy ending. And then he ran away. And I was like, oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Never mind.
Especially since it really seemed like he's the one that lit the fire.
Yeah. That's like, he definitely lit the fire.
What tells you that he lit the fire? We'll start there.
He's brought up like burning. It's like, what did you say? It's like, here's the ending. It's like, oh, you know what Pastor talking about? It's like, I burned everything. Fine. It's like, right before he ran away.
Yeah.
She also asked him that when he kind of delayed in answering, which was sus.
So, sus, by the way, is an accurate literary critical term, and you can absolutely use it in an essay.
Oh, right here. It's like, I've done everything for you. I've burned, ... I burned down my dreams for you and all that. And I was just like, oh, well, did you just burn down the entire city?
Oh, sorry. What scene is this? No, just so what scene?
20.
Scene 20.
At the very end.
Oh, yes, there it is. Yeah. Page 68 for those of you who are following along on that version. So right before scene 21. So I jumped at the chance to come to this new world. There are opportunities here that I can't even begin to imagine. American dream style opportunities. Just sitting there waiting to be discovered. We can maybe unpack that as well. I've done everything for you. I've burnt down my dreams for you. But with you, I'll always be running, and I can't run anymore. I can't. I'm sorry, I just can't do it. Please understand. I can't. So that's one way in which she kind of subverts our expectations, right? But even if they did run away together, the play from the start kind of tells you how it ends. So would it have been a happy ending? Would it have been satisfying if they run away and then she dies?
Yeah, then it was like a big moment.
Okay, so you would have found it cathartic at least on that level.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
I was really hoping for that.
Interesting. Okay.
I thought maybe that both of them would get hanged.
Right. Yeah.
But he got away.
I like it to be like some tragic love story at the end.
I guess that's what makes it tragic, right? Is the fact that he doesn't go with her, right? Because it's not a physical death, but it's still tragic in the sense that he's not there.
But then I feel like it's more betrayal and selfish. Because he could have gone with her.
I don't know if it's fair to say it's selfish.
That he ran off and left her to her tree.
Well, yes, in some sense, yeah. No, on the one hand, it is selfish, but would it have been better if they both died?
Yes, because then there would have been no betrayal.
Yeah.
Especially since he's the one that did.
Fine, I'm a garbage human being, I guess, right? No, but I make jokes, but I'm asking the question more of like, where does survival come into that, right? Into that discussion, right? I think we can't overestimate the power of wanting to live, right? Or the possibility of living.
Especially for men.
But then that's what it says in selfish.
Yes, for men, but also just in general, right? That's his
The reason
whole...
that men survive plane crashes more than women is because they step on everyone on their way out the door. It's statistically shown.
Is that real?
Yeah, it's real. There was a guy who abandoned his 2 little children to get off a plane when it was crashing, and then the flight attendant brought the children to him and was like, dude.
So I choose to take a more positive perspective on humanity. I get no, but okay. But for me, the only reason I'm ascribing this survival to Claude specifically, or this, I'm being more generous, I guess, is because of the hope that still drives that survival, right? That's what he's trying to convey. Arguably, it's foolhardy, but I think still that's what he's trying to convey with, I jumped at the chance to come to the new world, right? He's channeling that discourse that, by the way, you still see today, right? America is the land of opportunity. Anyone can do anything if you just apply yourself hard enough. I don't know to what extent that's true from a runaway slave, but it's a very, very powerful motivator, right? And again, I'm not saying that we have to forgive Claude. I do think there is like a very valuable reading in saying that it is a betrayal, but we can still understand the logic behind a betrayal, right? Yes, you had your hand up, and then, yeah.
But I feel like it makes it.
Yeah.
Humans are kind of selfish.
Humans can be very selfish. Yeah.
So I don't
As evidenced by the plane. Sorry, go ahead.
I wouldn't leave my kids.
No, I wouldn't leave my kids either. I don't have children, but I wouldn't. Yeah.
But I feel like that's what makes it more realistic.
Uh-huh.
Because I feel like most people would want to survive.
Especially because he's white and she's black, so he has more chance in that
Yes.
time period.
Yeah. Actually, I called him a runaway slave. It's like not technically accurate, but yeah. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was gonna say it did seem like because he says I've done everything for you. I've written down my dreams for you. It was kind of a shared dream before, but at this point he's like, I don't know if it's worth it at this point. But it like he's acting. He's because of his like survival instincts kicking in. I guess.
Yeah.
He's kind of he's realizing he doesn't have the same sort of drive that.
There's something really interesting in considering like what we're willing to do when we're dissociated from something. Not that it forgives, but like arson as a crime, generally speaking, right? The people who had their houses burned down didn't ask for that, right? But it's the same logic that justifies, for example, war crimes, right? Especially in the modern era, right? You brought up the Mel before the rhetoric that people had about to what extent they were willing to go through, right? Part of that is saying like, well, I wasn't there. I just gave the orders, right? And there's a distance.
Or I was just following.
Where I was just following orders. Drone strikes, right? Agent Orange instead of a sword.
Little boy, the nuclear bombs.
A nuclear bomb. So this kind of separation that the arson technically represents, right? Like, yes, I did a lot, but at the end of the day, I lit a match, right? Presumably. After that, it was, fate. The wind blew everything into that direction, right? And so it's a lot easier to justify that. And then you have to come face to face with the consequences of your actions. And a lot of people can't actually face up to that. Right? I think that's true. It does make him more human. We still dislike him for it, but I think that's kind of the point. Good. I still find it funny that a lot of you are like, yes, they should have ran away together. That's awesome. I'm going back briefly to the beginning in order to talk about the ending. The voiceover begins the play. Well, technically, it's not even the voiceover that begins the play. It's the sound of African drumming and the featureless silhouette of a woman dancing. Right? So that's interesting. With the backdrop of red, oranges, and yellows, suggestive of flames. There's a voiceover, and it writes in. Do I need to mention, like, if I say the N-word, right, it's just because I think we're all on board with that. I don't know. If you're not, just let me know. In 1734, a Negro slave set fire to the city of Montreal and was hanged. In 1734, a Negro slave set fire to the city of Montreal and was hanged. 1734, a Negro slave set fire to the city of Montreal and was hanged. A Negro slave set fire to the city of Montreal and was hanged. Slave set fire to the city of Montreal and was hanged. Set fire to the city of Montreal and was hanged. To the city of Montreal and was hanged. City of Montreal and was hanged. Montreal and was hanged and was hanged, was hanged and hanged. It's not exactly hiding what's happening. Right? 1 to a dozen times, hanged is mentioned right at the start. So
that's what I knew it wasn't a happy story.
Right. First of all, it does set up good, but this is leading up to a question. It sets up obviously the tone of the story. Right. There's not really going to be any humor in it, aside from maybe a bit of irony, perhaps, which can be a bit funny. But then where's the tension? Because usually a story has tension to it, right? You want to have some kind of stakes, but if you know how it's going to end, how does the story generate that tension?
She's asking the question, did she actually do arson? Was she guilty?
Good. So, that's a good way of framing it. Is she guilty? Whether she actually set the fire or not, or whether it's Claude that set the fire in a suggestive manner, where do we place guilt? That's, I think, a really interesting point of tension. Is Angélique guilty of arson? In the technical sense, yeah. Probably. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe it is Claude.
I never, at the very beginning, I never questioned that she didn't do it. Right. I just wondered how she got there, or how we were going to get there.
Good. So it's the journey that matters. Okay, that's another way of putting it. So the tension comes from guilt, the journey. I'm sorry?
Yeah, she was thanked for it, obviously. So I just kind of was like, okay, she must have done it. I just don't know why. Maybe she was justified. I don't know. I didn't know the stories. So.
Good.
But I feel like she's trying to show that in the part that you just read. That's the way history remembers her, but is it true? The fact that she was hanged is true, but everything else.
Yeah. Literally everything else, by the way. We have the trial transcripts, which are not as professional. I don't think I'll be teaching you anything new by saying that in the 1730s, trial transcripts were not as professional as they are today. So you can probably find them actually in a digitized archive. I'm sure online. I should have looked them up for this class, but there are so many gaps, right? What becomes a play here is basically, I think if I remember correctly, a page and a half right? And a lot of that is witness testimony, quote unquote, which she does dramatize in this very briefly. But there was an interesting term, I'm not sure who brought it up in the brief discussion. But when I ask who's guilty, it does inevitably bring up a question of absolution, right? Even if we find Angélique to be guilty of the crime of setting fire, do we think it's something that she deserves to be hanged for?
Is it justified? Is she justified in her actions?
Is she justified in her actions?
Maybe I'll be yeah.
Right. On the one hand, you're like, she was a slave who had very, very ill treatment, as you would expect. Rape, beatings, so on. On the other, she did burn down houses that had nothing to do, right, with what she was living through or what was, given to her, right? The neighbors, well, yes, technically the neighbors, yes. But the Hôtel Dieu, by the way, is a hospital, right? The hospital had nothing to do with her crime.
I would be under the assumption that any slave would be justified in burning all that shit down.
Right.
Because everybody is complicit,
Good.
or else she couldn't be a slave.
Then that's kind of my point. I'm asking the question, but I think the play also agrees with you, right? In saying that, in building a narrative in which you feel the justification at the end. You don't feel bad for the houses that were burned down. I didn't even feel bad when François died. Right?
Why would you?
Why would we? Right? It's like villain 101. Right? It's like when you see a Nazi in an Indiana Jones movie. I don't care that they got their faces melted off by like the whatever, right, spirits that came out of that box. The Ark of the Covenant, that's the word I was looking for. I don't care, right? They're literally the bad guys of history. I felt a little bit for Thérèse. A little bit. More than François.
Well, there's a point where like you feel sorry for her, but then she crosses the line.
Exactly. The narrative constantly sets up these tensions. These tensions of, I guess you could say, how could you frame this? These morality tensions throughout, right? But the baseline fact of slavery existing kind of makes the narrative override everything that happens in it, right? The play, rightfully, I think, takes the moral stance that slavery was bad. I think we can all agree on that one, right? And so therefore we are much more accepting as an audience of what might happen in that circumstance. Okay. I think that's in part why the girls in the back, when you were talking about Claude, it makes him so icky at the end, right? Because at the end of the day, yeah, he was an indentured servant, that's true, and he probably didn't live great conditions of indentured servitude. We know that from the historical record, right? That indentured servants were often mistreated. But considering the wider context, it becomes a little bit disingenuous. Right? And so we have difficulty with that as moderns. I think that's a really difficult thing to do in a play. Right? To get us from point A to point B, even though we know what's going to happen, and still somehow go on an emotional journey. This is something, again, that this is not unique to Lorena Gale, by the way. This setting up in a prologue or in the voiceover here of what the play is about. Famously, ancient Greek tragedies did this all the time, right? if any of you have ever read Oedipus Rex, right? Guy who kills his dad, sleeps with his mom, and sleeps with his mom and tears his eyes out, right? As a result, if you haven't, it's like a 30-page play. It's pretty good, but you know from the beginning what's going to happen, right? There is a chorus that tells you this guy's going to get screwed, right? You just don't know how he's going to get screwed.
How did they do this in Romeo and Juliet?
They absolutely do this in Romeo and Juliet. The first 50 lines of Romeo and Juliet says there's two families that are at war with each other. I'm paraphrasing here. Shakespeare says it better. There's two families at war with each other, and it's going to have dire consequences on their offspring. But those dire consequences are going to bring the two families together. Lo and behold, 5 acts and God knows how many scenes later, that's exactly what happens. And it's still one of the, well, I guess, greatest plays. It's still a great play of history. It's not his best play. I'll say that. It's his most, yeah, okay, that's good. It's his most well-known.
I think it's a good play as long as you don't take it as a romance.
No, which he wouldn't have either.
No.
Just watch the Leonardo DiCaprio version.
No, I like that version, actually. No, he didn't mean it as such. It's a joke.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which, unfortunately, none of the adaptations ever understood, I think. Right, that it is a joke. Especially not the freaking West Side Story. Is that what it's called? Yeah. The musical.
No, me
Very good. Is there anything else I wanted to add about the ending? Oh, yeah. Well, of course. No, please, go ahead. No.
Do you think Cloud ratted her out and told people where she was? Because he's still there at the end. In the crowd. Yeah, he's in the crowd. But is he like living? That's also, yeah.
Yeah, because, but I guess it is always a question, like, what is reality in this play, right? Because it's both then and now, and the O.J. Simpson references and the current affairs references, like, does O.J. Simpson suddenly appear in the 1730s? I hope not. That would be bizarre. So she is actively playing with this. I think, like a lot of things, the reality doesn't really matter. What matters, I think, to this is the representation of reality, right? Even if it's not literally Claude, there's someone like Claude in the audience, right? That's my reading of it. You can disagree. Yeah, you're referring to a male voice called softly from the crowd, is that it?
And it was right at the very beginning of that last.
Oh, yes. Okay, at the beginning of scene 23. During this, Claude enters dressed in the same fashion as do all the actors. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's just one of... For me, I read that as metaphorical more than anything, but maybe that's just me taking the easy way out. What did we make of that last scene? The literal last scene. Angélique steps up to a microphone. Weird anachronism. Does anyone else want to read it? I can read it, I don't mind. But if anyone wants to read it, go on once.
Read it. My name is Marie-Joseph Angélique. I'm 29 years old. I came from Portugal, from the island of Madeira, where I was sold to a Flemish who brought me to this new world and sold me to Monsieur, I don't speak French, I'm sorry.
Monsieur de Francheville.
De Francheville.
Mm-hmm.
But before, look, the view is clear, so clear from here. In the vista of tomorrow stretching out before, I can see the city swarming with ebony. There's me and me and me and me, my brothers and my sisters. My brothers and my sisters, arrested for their difference, their misery, a silent scream, rising to crescendo and falling on deaf ears. There is nothing I can say to change what you perceive. I will from twisted history be guilty in your eyes. If thought is sin, then I am guilty, for I wish that I had fanned the flames that lead to your destruction. But though I am wretched, I am not wicked. Take my breath, burn my body, throw my ashes to the wind, set my spirit free. The truth cannot be silenced. Someday someone will hear me and believe I didn't do it. Until then, I'm going home. Can you see the fires rise to greet the sunset?
Thank you. I can see the city swarming with ebony. Has anyone here ever been to Montreal? Would you say it's swarming with ebony? I wouldn't say so, but I like the image nonetheless. Even if historical reality didn't necessarily pan out that way, I like that idea of her casting herself and, as she says, her brothers and sisters into the future. Right? Don't get me wrong, there's a notable Black population in Montreal, and it's a vibrant part of our culture. But I wouldn't necessarily swarming, but it's such a powerful and evocative term. Why swarming with ebony? What does that evoke for you? I have my own idea, but I'm curious if anyone has anything. Are you serious?
Yeah.
Okay, so ebony is how did I just
It's like a black gem.
yeah, is it a gem technically? So usually it's associated to ivory because of the song, but it's a black material. I don't want to say gem because I'm not genuinely sure what the material is specifically, but it's a black hard material. Ebony. I thought it was a kind of wood, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, it's wood. Yeah. Mainly from a tropical tree. Okay, so I didn't know the tropical tree part. Right? That maybe adds a little bit a layer of interest here. But yeah, it's very black type of wood, right? And usually, actually, you hear a lot, especially at that time, the discourse around race was to define or describe Black people along terms like this, right? People with ebony skin, right? And usually, if they use the term Negro, it was a obviously derogatory term, right? And usually, ebony was used in a way that highly romanticized Black people, right? Which you see a lot in François' discourse and Ignace's discourse, right? When they're talking about getting César and Angélique together, right, and looking at them like people behind a double-sided mirror, right? You see a lot of that discourse of like, oh, Africans are very sexual beings, right? And you know, like that kind of like colonial romanticization of the sexuality, quote unquote, of othered people often comes up in the use of ebony. I'm sure that was more information than you expected from that answer, but I think that's what it's in part trying to evoke. But the use of the term swarming is a really odd one to associate with ebony, right? Because swarming invokes for me like bugs.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking about mosquitoes earlier, like getting swarmed by mosquitoes is a horrible experience, right? Or flies or whatever. Right? So it's not exactly a positive image necessarily, right? Or at least our expectations, to come back to that term of it, are not exactly positive. But I would say there's a bit of hope in that statement.
To me, it's like a picture of them, a lot of them, milling around freely.
Yeah. Milling around freely, a more cynical reading of it would be a kind of revenge, right? Swarming over something. But I like the idea of swarming around freely, right? Look at a pack of, like, again, if just to use that very simple image, like a bunch of flies swarming around, right? Just kind of going wherever, right? I think that's the image that's meant to be evoked, even if, of course, she's not making the comparison one-to-one between black people and flies. That's obvious. But the movement, certainly, I think, is meant to be evoked. And yet, despite that freedom of movement, in the next, I guess you would say stanza, I guess you could call it this, a kind of poem at the end, the brothers and sisters are still arrested for their difference. So she's getting at the heart of this dichotomy. That's hinted at in the play, right? Here and there. Oh, are you free? I know I'm kind of free in some respects, but not in others. This comes back to the conversation she had with Manon, right? You know, I'm starving, but at least I can do whatever I want, type of thing.
Did she actually say those words?
Yeah.
Because that's pretty, I feel like it's kind of prophetic in a way.
Mm-hmm.
How people are treated differently by police, etc., etc.
When you say, did she actually say those words, like in the historical record?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I don't think so. Well, first of all, because she would have been speaking French. I could translate it for you in French, but it wouldn't sound good to you. As far as I know, we don't have her last words. Maybe, again, someone who has their computer open can fact check me on this, but as far as we know, we don't have her last words. I would be very surprised if the historical record of the 18th century, the historical archive, would have recorded that. It's possible weirder things have happened. I would just be personally shocked. Yeah. And then, yeah, there is nothing I can say to change what you perceive. I will, from twisted history, be guilty in your eyes. Coming back to what I mentioned at the start of class, right? These kind of forces of history. She's one individual acting within this moment, within this lineage, and she clearly sees it as getting better. But at the end of the day, it's a collective process, right, over time. Arguably, acts of rebellion like this do move things forward, right? Otherwise, people wouldn't do them. Okay? Or at least, even if they don't work in the moment, they are powerful enough in people's imaginaries that people will continue to do these movements. Right?
I mean, there's got to be some people who genuinely believe that black slaves were happy in North America being taken care of.
Of course.
Yeah.
That's the whole narrative behind the house slave that Toni Morrison talks about.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So for those of you who don't know, right, this idea of and Malcolm X brings this up as well, and it's demonstrated in that movie that I mentioned earlier. Right? The house slave is not going to be the one to criticize and change the system because he's well fed and kept. Right? He uses that gendered language, by the way. Whereas the regular slave, the field slave, Malcolm X used that term, is the one that's going to actually give the rebellion. Now, is that actually accurate? I think a lot of house slaves participated in that movement, but that discourse certainly existed. Yes, certainly. And then I want to mention one last thing here, which will, I think, allow us to go back. Set my spirit free, the truth cannot be silenced. And then she goes on. And there's a really interesting stage direction. Drums start beating softly and grow. I am going home. The hangman goes to put the noose around her neck. She takes it from him. Can you see the fires rise to greet the sunset? She puts the noose around her own neck. A male voice calls softly from the crowd. Claude, Angélique, Angélique. The soft sound of drums building. And the last sounds we hear are not only the platform giving out, right, for the hanging, but then the drums overpower that sound. Where do those drums come from? I don't think it's a true question here. No. I mean, but off the stage, yes. From the microphones, from the speakers off stage, yes. I mean, in the logic of the play, what is the source of the drums? Would they be in the crowd, for example? I would say no. Okay, so in her head, sure. But even that you can push a little bit further because the drum motif comes back over and over again.
In history?
History can be one of them. Are they... Do we imagine like a drum set from like the guy from a rock drummer? No, what kind of drum set are we imagining here?
African drums.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, whatever you say. African drums is what I think it's meant to be, right? I am going home. The drums play. What does this call back to in the play? Let's go back to the conversation with Manon. What does she mention when she's talking to Manon? It's on scene 7 for those of you who are looking, so page 54. Or it starts there, but that's not where it's specifically mentioned. It's on page 55. Why? Kind of.
What scene is it?
Scene 7. Back to scene 7. If I'm not mistaken.
Or she's like, as she speaks, she gradually stops narrating on herself as her rhythms are taken up by the real drum. That's on page 55.
No.
Or she says, like, what do you hear?
Do we have different... Oh, yeah, okay. So just before... Yeah, bottom of 54. Just before Manon does not respond, she says something. So Angélique says, when we cross the great river, in this case, I think she's referencing the Atlantic, right? The Atlantic slave trade. When we crossed the great river, some leapt into the water to become froth upon the waves, which is a historical thing that happened. Some hunkered on their haunches and simply willed themselves to sleep. Because when the spirit leaves your body, it flies home to the motherland. What do you see when you look at the river? What do you hear? How fast your heart must beat when you look in that direction, knowing home is close and yet impossible to reach. And then the play ends with the sound of African drums playing as she's dying. Is it in her mind? Maybe. But we can make a more interesting reading of that, I think. Even if it is in her mind, let's push that. Why would that be so important to put into the play?
Because she's going home by dying. In the same way that those otherwise jumped into the water to go home, or sat down and died to go home.
So it creates a historical parallel, right? Dying in Montreal or dying on the boat over from Africa to the New World, quote unquote, right? Regardless of where you die, you're going back home. Right? Again, you see this type of discourse all the time. Right? It's the basic discourse behind martyrdom. Right?
And it's in like lots of times that's sort of described like that, like hearing angels sing before they die, or like the horns of Valhalla, or whatever it is. You know, that's very common.
Yeah.
Going home to where your afterlife is.
Yes. And all of these discourses do one thing in particular in relation to the individual and death. It offers a kind of choice. Right? You talked about Valhalla, right? They kind of make fun of that in the Thor movies. Right? It was like, haha, like, we're going to go into battle. I don't know if I'm going to die, but if I do, it's going to be on my own terms. Right? obviously I'm not comparing Angélique to Thor, right? Like that's not what I'm doing, but
I mean, you kind of are.
but kind of. I'm comparing the discourse. Right? That's why it becomes so powerful when she grabs her own noose. She doesn't want to die, right? She's not suicidal in that sense, but she knows that the death is inevitable. At that point, it was going to happen, right? So what does she do? She gives herself agency, takes the agency literally from history, right? From the historical event that she's in of slavery in order to go back home. Probably the closest thing to like the ultimate agency that she could have in that particular moment. I don't know. I'm not a writer. I just criticize literature, right? But I find that more cathartic. Like when I read something like this, I know it's good because I can't imagine it happening another way. Like happening another way would have felt like cheating for me. Not like cheating, yeah. It would have felt cheap. I don't know. It feels right. Because we know from the historical record that she does die. So that's inevitable. So what do you do with that? You make it as agential as possible.
What if they would have gone away together?
I guess they do kind of end up together at the end because he's there.
In the crowd watching her die.
Yes.
How romantic.
Yeah, exactly. That's all I ever want.
Yeah, that's cute.
I mean, there is something about to say about not acknowledging the people in the crowd, right? Not acknowledging that Claude is there. And you see this in a lot of, I don't know if as a class you have experienced someone dying before, right? You do get that sometimes, where people don't necessarily want to be surrounded by everyone else, right? You do because you're still living and you want to hang on to that memory of that person, right?
A lot of the times it's when people aren't around that the dying will let go.
Died in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
When everyone was sleeping. That's what happened to my grandmother. Right? 3 a.m. just, right? And she would have wanted that, I think. Right? So there is something really interesting about not just taking your own noose, but also choosing to not acknowledge who's looking at you while you're dying. Right? Dying on your own terms on all levels. And this is kind of a half-baked thought that I'm thinking of as this is kind of coming out, so feel free to add on to it or disagree with me, but as I'm thinking about other people that have died around me or talking to other people who have experienced similar experiences, I feel like it's more common than not. Right? Yeah, I don't know what else to say about that. That's just where my mind went. Ayan, where are we going to next in the play? Did you read it?
No.
Okay.
Confrontation between Therese and Angélique.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Which scene?
When she confronts her about sleeping with her husband.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. So, scene 18, Act 2, scene 18. For me, it's page 39, 38, 39. More 39. No, 39. 39 to the end of... Oh, no, sorry, Act 1. Sorry, scene 18. My apologies. Just before Act 2. Does anyone want to stage this?
Let's go back.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, Mark and I, do you want to play two women? Yeah.
Can't find it. Ours are different.
You want to control F it? You can search in your text. The first words of it are, tell me something, question mark.
Sorry, what scene is this in?
The scene 18, the very last scene of Act 1.
So after the guy dies, she has a chance to redeem herself.
Yes, so after Francois dies, certainly.
Oh, yes, that did work. I just need to check. You can just search it. Page, for us, it's page 50.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Oui, madame. Thérèse, with difficulty but without malice. Oh. I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed vibes. Oh, devastating. Did you like it? Beat. When he came to you at night. No, madame. All this time? No, madame. Why didn't you come to me? You have punished me for less, madame. I have punished you because you could have stopped him. You could have tried to stop him. So could you. He was your husband. The master only took from me what you refused to give. Yeah, that's a kick in the shit, isn't it? You ungrateful, jealous, slut, black bitch, lying whore. You liked it when he took you. Yeah, and it goes on and berates her. Yeah. And you didn't. You sent him... Yeah, you liked it. And you didn't. You sent him to me. The fault is yours, madam, not mine. I know that you have lost yourself in grief. I know the anger and the rage of loss, how hard it is to contain, how it needs to unleash itself on something, but I'm not going to let you beat it out on me. Do you understand? Do not strike me again. Thérèse collapses in her grief and tears. François. He's gone, madam. It's just you now. You have to be strong. Angélique cradles her. That's right. Let it out. Let it all out. I know that things haven't been good between us, but that's all going to change now. I'll serve you well. If you will let me, I'll serve you. When I was talking about like the slight bit of feeling that I had toward Thérèse, it's this moment, personally.
See, I don't have that. I'm like, you should be blaming your husband, not Angélique.
Oh, she absolutely should. But it comes back to I think, again, creating very human characters.
Mm-hmm.
When we're facing loss and anger, how many of us actually act rationally? Speaking for myself, no. Right? I very rarely explode, right, in anger towards many things. Like a real man, I bury it deep down inside of me until I just cannot take it anymore. I'm saying that as a joke. I'm very much in touch with my feelings. It's fine. But yeah, like ultra society, it usually, because things like anger and resentment are, especially in 18th century highly moral society, not something that you should demonstrate publicly. It's often the case that when it is demonstrated, it explodes in big bad ways. Right? To use another example, the time in history when there was the most psychos, right, like psychotic killers, is during the Victorian era. Right? Just freaks all around. Because, and I use this term very loosely, but because morally and societally it was so repressed. We know this from historical records, right? And just statistically. I say the most in history. I actually don't know like statistics, but like there were some weird people, right? And also in part because they could get away with it because technology was not what it was today for actually finding people, and we couldn't actually use things like DNA evidence until the 30s in court. So people would just do whatever for the longest time. I think like the 1930s or 40s, we couldn't actually use that in court as evidence. Maybe even later than that. Yeah.
Is Jack the Ripper Victorian?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Jack the Ripper was that Victorian era.
Okay.
H.H. Holmes, right, would have been around that same time as like those weird murder houses. Yeah. No, I'm not even joking. Look, this is not going to become a true crime podcast, but like...
Please?
No. I refuse. But what I mean is like that explosion of anger at least tracks in my mind. Right? But still, despite tracking in my mind, I think you're right that Angélique is correct at the end of the day. Like, none of this is my fault. Her fault, right? It's obviously not. No, she could not have stopped him. Even if she tried. Even if, yes, okay, you could have tried. What are the consequences of that? Right?
But I don't like how Angélique put the blame then on Therese because it takes away agency from Francois.
Yeah.
Therese shouldn't be blamed. Like, she doesn't owe anything to her husband.
Yeah.
He needs to just... I almost wonder if that was like a turning point in the conversation where like they could have maybe, but then...
Yeah. I think so. Yeah, it's a moment where, and you see this in a lot of early feminist writing that was emerging around this time, right? You're like, oh, cool, some like early ideas of what a woman's role, for example, is within the marriage, within the household, and so on. Like, what power do you actually have, right? I was mentioning Mary Shelley, right, a few days ago. Her mother was famously writing around this time and was hyper radical. Right? Mary Wollstonecraft, basically a 18th century anarchist. Awesome stuff, right?
Also romantic scenes.
Yes. Her husband was also a big anarchist at the time. Anyway, so you do see this kind of discourse emerging of like, okay, so what kind of power do women have within the household and within marriage? But you see, I think, in this dialogue, where it bucks up to social reality, right? Especially in the colonies, right? Where often, and rather unfortunately, the realities of what I guess could still be called survival were still very much into play, and what that often meant is relegating to older social norms. Right or wrong, that's kind of how it happened, right? People relegated back to what they knew, which is why you see often this discourse that, quote unquote, the colonies, like Canada, for example, were a little bit backward or behind what was happening in Europe. That's no longer really true, but you see that kind of reality and talk emerging. But I think you're right, Mel, that this is kind of the point of no return at some point between the two. Despite Angélique comforting her at the end of the scene, I think this is exactly where Thérèse decides to sell her. Even if she doesn't acknowledge it yet, that's where that decision is made.
Well, wasn't she saying to Francois earlier that she wanted her, when she first started suspecting, she wanted to get rid of them?
But then Francois was in the way of course, doing that. He would have been the final arbiter of making that decision.
Yeah. Like, wasn't she even saying, like, if you love me, you'll do this or something like
It's almost a bigger slap in the face that Angélique does cradle her. Right? I don't know. Look, I've never been in a situation where my partner has ever cheated on me. That's not. But I feel like it would be awful to have my partner's lover comfort me. Like, I feel like that is so condescending. Right? So So again, playing with this tension of, yes, Angélique is ultimately the hero of the story, if you want to use that term. I don't think it's a correct term necessarily here, but she's the main character, the protagonist, that who you follow, that which you follow, who you follow. But that doesn't mean that she's perfect either, right? Or that there can't be tension within the dynamics.
What I wondered was if she said that as something that could have been appropriate to be said in the 1700s, or if that was more of a 1998 sensibility that your husband is going to go and cheat on you if you don't give him what he wants at home.
You definitely saw that at the time.
In the 1700s?
Also
It's
in 1998.
It's and in 1998.
Yeah, I would have thought 1998.
The more things change, the more they say the same. It's unfortunate, but it's very shocking how far back you can go and see this idea of, well, obviously you have to put out or he's going to leave you. I'm putting it in a crude manner in this case because it is ultimately a crude idea. But yes, it is a very old idea.
And you were talking earlier about like women's roles in household at that time. That's one of the primary roles. Unfortunately.
Yeah. Why did you want to talk about that?
I don't know. It was I don't know.
Is it already 8:40? Oh my god.
It was intense.
Yeah, it was a very tense.
Yes. Okay, so because we're approaching the end of class soon, it is worth taking a minute here. I think we can all agree that there's tension here. Okay, good. So we were wondering earlier about writing a literary essay. Here's an example. What makes this scene tense? What in the actual words, setup, context, aftermath makes this scene tense? Okay. You can answer that now if you want, but for example, it can be something like what you were bringing up, Mark, earlier, of the idea that this was kind of set up earlier, right? Thérèse mentioning that she feels uncomfortable with Angélique's presence, so that when it finally comes back, right, you remember that scene earlier and you realize, oh, so it's playing off of that, right? So it immediately sets the stage, right?
If you're writing a paper on a specific spot, there's some proof and to how there's tension and build up towards it.
Exactly. Not
I
only
also think like with Angélique, kind of, I guess, sticking up for herself builds tension too, because you don't know what's going to happen next.
Yes, exactly. Right? How is Thérèse going to actually react to that? Is she going to beat her? Is she going to sell her? Is she going to find God and like completely let her go? No, unfortunately, right? Because then that would kind of defeat the tension, right?
I almost would expect her to just retreat into like a depressive state and like not function.
But again, would that then diffuse the tension? Because then you don't have anything to pay it off. Right? Completely unrelated. How many of you here have seen the movies of Alfred Hitchcock? Some, like Vertigo or whatever. Yeah. Rear Window. Master of suspense. Because he understood the concept of setup and payoff. And he actually has this wonderful interview. Is it with François Truffaut? Famous French director, where he talks about if you have a scene between two people talking in a restaurant and there's a bomb under the table, by the end of the scene, the bomb has to go off. Otherwise, it's just two people talking and it's not tense at all. Right? So there has to be that release somewhere. So part of your hypothetical essay in this case would be, where is the tension let off? Is it when Thérèse tries to sell Angélique is it when Angélique actually gets caught, right? Like there's a few moments that you could probably argue are the payoff to that tension.
M. Night Shyamalan, his tension building is insane too. With like Sixth Sense and Village, those ones are really.
Yeah, good. So actually, M. Night Shyamalan's a really good example because when it works beautifully.
Silence.
But then, like his worst movies are the ones in which the tension is just completely flattened out.
The Happening.
Right? The Happening. Great, right? Well, first of all, the acting's awful in that one. But at first you're like, okay, well, what's happening? And technically it builds tension. What's killing all these people? It's the trees. Oh,
Yeah.
that sucks. It wasn't telegraphed well enough at all. Right? Arguably, Signs, I feel, fails a little bit at that.
A little bit, yeah. Village was really good though at that.
Village was good. Right? What's the other one? Unbreakable. That one works well as well. This new one, Trap, actually does a pretty good job with that tension. Right? He actually manages to pay it off.
I gave up on him with The Happening.
No, that's fair. That's entirely legitimate because it didn't get better for a long time. But the Trap is quite good. It's with, what's his name? Absolute heartthrob of a man. Oh, shoot. Josh Hartnett. Yeah.
Maggie's heartthrob,
Yeah. Playing a dad. Okay. So yeah, scene 4, page 8, and this is where I think we'll end because of time. Unless anyone has a very specific scene that they want to bring up and they absolutely cannot hold it in anymore. Okay. You could have, it's fine.
Do I have one?
Do you really?
Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
That one, I don't know which scene it is though, but the one where she's talking about the mythology, the darkness and the light.
Mm-hmm. It's in that same scene that we were talking about with Manon earlier. It's right after that.
Which scene is that?
So, when we were talking about going home, and
The river.
The river.
Something about 7.
yeah, so Act 2, Scene 7.
No, it's Act 1, Scene 10.
What?
In the beginning, there was darkness.
Oh, that darkness, because the darkness comes back in that passage. Okay, yeah, sorry. Okay, so you said Act 1,
Scene 10.
Scene 10. Okay, sorry, I was thinking of something else. Yes, okay, in the beginning, yeah. What did you want to talk about with that passage? So for me, it's page 20. Why that passage in particular?
Okay, so because she's talking about the darkness,
Yes.
to just sum it up really quickly,
Mhm.
the origin of the darkness giving birth to the light, and then the
Yeah.
light rebelling and taking over everything, and
Mhm.
then she says at the end, there's something else we know, my child, that in the end darkness reclaims everything, the stars will fall, the sun will cease to shine, light will collapse in on itself, till once again it is nothing more than just a little spark, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
But I almost wonder if she, like, maybe this is way flung far-fetched, but I almost wonder if she killed her own babies to keep them from a life of slavery.
Well, doesn't she smother her
Yeah, I
child?
was gonna say, wasn't I remembering her covering a baby's mouth with her hand and watching it die and then saying it was better?
Later in
that
the
way?
play, she does exactly that.
Does she?
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah. So she has a child, and later smothers it. She never said explicitly why, but I think you're right.
For all of them?
I don't know for all of them. That is what we call the hors text, right? Outside of the text, so we can't really speak to that, right? Usually we try as much as possible to stick to the text because it's what we have. After that, it becomes fan fiction, which is fine. I have nothing against fan fiction, but it's not really literary criticism. But I'd have to find exactly where she does it. But yeah, it does happen that she smothers her child.
23.
Scene 23?
Page 23.
Oh, page 23. Okay, so it's just a few pages after that.
Before that?
Yeah, right after, actually, what you just said. Puts her hand over the baby's face, smothering it.
Oh my god.
The heartbeat stops. Silence.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
This is what happens when you read it in multiple little chunks.
No, that's fair. Yeah, as much as we're not reading other plays, but just, again, for your own benefit, plays are one of those things that are better when you read it in one go. Right? Again, try to imagine it on the stage. Yes, you have like a intermission. Intermission. Yes. I was thinking entr'acte and was like, no, there's a better English word. But yeah, there's an intermission, but usually it's not that big. Right? So it fits in with the sense of flow. So real quick, that same scene, as last point, I know people are starting to yawn, don't worry. In the beginning, there was darkness. What is she playing on here? Bible, right? In the beginning, there was the Word, and the Word was God, and let there be light, and so on, right? Subversion of that same discourse that we were talking about earlier justified slavery, or was used to justify slavery. So scene 4, right at the beginning, I want to come back to what she was saying when she said, this time will be different. Having gone through the play, from back to end, apparently, is she correct? Does her own prophecy come true? Is it different this time?
Kind of. It's different in the sense that it's on her in her own terms.
Mm-hmm. So the addition of some form of agency makes it different.
Something I thought was weird about it was that I was under the impression that she was like this was her first time being sold. Like maybe I'm wrong on that, but as I was wondering what she was comparing to that.
But no, because we read at some point that she used to belong to a Flemish person.
Well, the Flemish person is what brought her from her home. So, like, I don't know, you know what I mean? Like, I kind of was wondering about if I was reading into that wrong or not.
But I think technically he bought her. Like, usually, I think the way it worked is that the slavers, right, the ship people bought it and then bought the people and then sold them once they reached the coast. So technically, they would have been the owners, I guess, for that period. Right.
Yeah, like I don't know enough about the slavery origins, but I do know like sometimes there are people would sell them to slavers just to make money and
someone in Africa had to sell them.
Yes,
so
exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. So you would say no, not really different in that sense?
Different than what is what our question is exactly. Good. Like what is she comparing it to, right?
That's a really valid question. Essay topic, perhaps. Because yes, on the one hand, there's the agency thing. But yeah, in what context are we talking about difference? Right? This time it will be different for me, personally. Is she saying from now on it will be different for all slaves? Is she saying this time it will be different for the historical record? Is this Lorena Gale being cheeky and saying this time the story is going to be different than what you expect? It's not your typical slave narrative, right? Kind of winking at the audience. Hold on to your seats. This is going to be a different one.
Can it be all of them?
Yes, of course it can be all of them. That's the ultimate postmodern move. Mm-hmm. It's everything. There's not just one truth. It feels like cheating to say that there's not just one truth and it can be a bit of everything, which is why people try to avoid it as much as possible. But technically, yeah, you just have to decide which you find is the most convincing. I think at the end I do buy into the idea that it's both the narrative that it will be different, and that despite the fact that we know where it's going to end, there is a difference in, there's enough of a difference in the ending that is stated and the ending that actually happens that it is different. Because yes, she is hanged, but she's hanged herself. Right? Did we like this play? Yeah?
Yeah, it's surprising.
This is actually the first time I teach this. Right? Never taught this before. I've read it a few times in different classes that I took when I was your age, but never never taught it. I'm glad people appreciated it.
It was weird that I just sat there and read the whole picture and saw it. I was just like, oh.
Okay, so you were engrossed into it, right, in that sense. Okay, good. Yeah. That can be a very difficult thing to do, right? Actually grabbing people while still technically moralizing, right? Yeah, awesome. Any other final thoughts? Oh, damn it, I forgot to talk about the music. Well, yeah.
7 minutes.
We have 7, okay. Go for it. Why are the music, well, we talked about the drums a little bit, but why do you think the music is important here?
Well, sometimes it's sort of a joyful element.
Mm-hmm.
It's all the darkness.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes is the style of music indicated sometimes?
Mm-hmm.
Modern styles.
Yeah. And there's one that I wanted to play because it's a really good example of the anachronisms that are happening in the play. Did any of you look up at the beginning of scene 4, Agony by Angie Angel? No? Here. I found it earlier on Google, so I know it exists.
A Donald Trump reference, I just saw it again. That's crazy. This is from
98. Well, okay, so yeah, find that reference because we can talk about it, but
sorry.
it's yeah. When were you born?
Me?
Yeah.
2001.
Okay, so yeah, this is something we kind of forget now with the fact that he's the goddamn president, but
Yeah, he was a guy before.
he was a joke.
Yeah.
Right? Like, he was the butt of jokes for decades.
Yeah.
Right? That's just a byproduct of its time.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy.
Still is.
And still is. But for a different reason.
I just put the button app in base 44. It's just built enough.
Impossible. But this one is dedicated to all of the man them and them pick up them chest and send them 10 to the walk. Why man do not flip the agony? We can't pick the dumb friend.
17th century bangers, right?
Yes, we want it all on it. Oh, we want it all on it. We want it all on it. Hear this. Just make me so done.
This time will be different.
Don't tell us all. It was you know money. Perfect. Me just like a star from just like a pizza from burning. Now I'm fire. Now we don't have smoke from it. We have to stand in our night. You don't panic. Run up the night. It's never breaking. We want it all on it. Yes, we want it all on it. Oh, we want it all on it. We want it all on it. Hear this. We are the champions.
This time will be different. Does anyone know about this? So one of the things... Put this in the background. One of the things that happened during the O.J. Simpson trial, which happened 2 years before this was published, right, is that after during the quote-unquote trial of the century, there were plenty of pictures, of course, that came out. And one particular famous magazine decided to publish this one. if you've never seen O.J. Simpson in real life at the time, he's not that black. It's closer to the one next to it. Time deliberately emphasizing the blackness of a criminal, right? Yeah. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Much as I really appreciate the hope that I think technically this kind of ends on, in some ways. It's things like this that make me realize why she published the play when she did. Right? He was already a criminal. You didn't need to make him blacker than he actually was.
But he was.
Look, I'm not going to be the arbiter of that one. Yeah, exactly. Just yeah, hold on. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
I was asking what his sense.
Yes, he is dead.
What he did.
Oh, what he did.
Kill his wife.
So presumably, allegedly, he never got accused of it. He never got convicted of that specifically, but we all know. He murdered his wife and her lover. Yeah, he was a murderer. Famous football player. Famous football player in the 80s. Had a brief career in movies. In such marvelous films as The Naked Gun, starring Leslie Nielsen, Canadian icon, my boy. And yeah, then murdered his wife and her lover. Got off on a technicality after the most boring car chase on the face of the planet.
The white girl.
Why did he go to jail then?
For something else, it was... I think it was tax. Yeah, got him on taxi.
There was a couple of things. I think he did a robbery in Las Vegas or something too.
Yeah, there was like a bunch of other stuff that he did. I forget off the top of my head, but yeah, there was a bunch of other stuff that they did, and they got him for that. But the murder part was never what he was accused of.
To make it more interesting, his lawyer was the Kardashian guy.
Yes.
Robert Kardashian.
Yeah.
So his lawyer was Kim Kardashian's dad.
Yeah.
The female, the trans female.
No, not Bruce Jenner. Yeah, Robert Kardashian.
That's
yeah. Damn it, I'm looking it up on my computer.
Rich though, for him to be robbing someone.
He was sketchy.
Yeah. Look, there are a million documentaries on him that will inform you much more than I ever could about this. I know of it, and I know mostly about things like this, but I'm not that well versed in the tragedy that O.J. Simpson's final years were. Yeah, spent a bit of time in jail and published a memoir after If I Did It, which apparently slips less into the conditional as it goes along, which is a bit creepy. But yeah, the point is, it's an interesting moment in time where we feel for Angélique, right, and wonder about their guilt and absolution. I think inevitably, because it was still an ongoing thing at the time, I'm sure things like this were in the back of Lorena Gale's mind when she was writing this play.
I'm dating myself, but I'm 43 years old, and I remember this was all there was on TV for years, basically.
Yeah. I was still quite young when this started, but I don't remember it actively, but yeah, apparently from when my parents or older people than I told me, it was just all people could talk about. All right. For tomorrow, Jordan Abel and Liz Howard ending the week on some really interesting poetry. we're not going to do poetry the entire time. I know we've been doing a lot of poetry for this first week. Part of that is because it's easy to do for the first week, and it gives you more time to read some of the longer stuff like this and the wars. Come to me if you have any questions about anything. I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.